Last week we were looking at the resurrection of the dead, the catching away of the believers that will occur according to Jewish teaching on the Feast of Trumpets, or as it's called today, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Remember that festival, that particular appointment of God, is a festival that teaches us about the beginning of the Messianic kingdom. Where we left off in last week's program was looking at the different trumpets, or the different shofarim. So we'll go to the board and pick up right where we left off last week. In Jewish thought, there are three different trumpets. The first trumpet is going to be called first trump, or in Hebrew, shofar. Now, a shofar is a ram's horn trumpet. There are two types of trumpets in the Bible, the silver trumpet and the ram's horn trumpets. This first trump is found in Exodus 19, verse 19. It is the festival of Shavuot, or Pentecost. And at this particular festival, or at this particular time, God, in Exodus 19, had betrothed himself to Israel. Now let's write this on the board. Let's write betrothal. Betrothal. Now in betrothal, what we have is marriage. It's very different from engagement, which we have in our culture, in our society today. When you're betrothed, you are married. You might remember in Matthew chapter 1 that Joseph was betrothed to Mary, or Miriam as her Hebrew name would be, and he said, take now your wife, Mary, and take her to yourself. Don't be afraid to do this. When you're betrothed, this is the state. You are now in a marriage. You are called married. She is the wife, you are the husband, or the other way around. But the two of you do not yet live together. You've been bought with a price. You've been consecrated. You've been sought out. You have been separated to your husband. But yet the two of you do not yet enter into marriage. So with the first trump in Exodus 19, verse 19, God betroths himself to Israel. The second trump in Judaism is called the last trump, or the last, well, let me erase this and put it over at the other place. The last trump, or the last shofar. Now this is the trumpet of Rosh Hashanah. This is the trumpet of the resurrection of the dead. And we read last week in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 50, going on down, it says, we shall not all sleep, but we shall be all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the dead in Messiah shall be raised, and so forth. All right. Now the last trump, these two trumpets are taken from a particular passage found in Genesis chapter 22 called the Akedah. The Akedah is a term for Genesis 22, and it means the binding of the sacrifice. The binding of the sacrifice. I'd like for you to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 22, and we'll work there for a few minutes. In Genesis chapter 22, we're going to see this, by the way, the Akedah is the most important passage among the Jewish people to this day. Every week in the synagogue, Genesis 22 is read, and it is the primary Torah reading, or reading from the first 5 books of the Bible, that is done during Rosh Hashanah. So the Akedah is a theme of this particular festival. Now in Genesis chapter 22, we're told, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, or Abraham, and he said, here am I. In Hebrew you would say, Hineni. This is an amazing thing to me, because generally when God speaks to us, what we say, how we respond is, what do you want? We hear God will call to us and he'll say, he'll call us by name, and we say, what do you want, God? But Abraham responded, here I am. And what a difference in attitude that if we could receive that, that when God calls to us, we say, God, here I am. Whatever you say, I'm ready. Lead me and guide me. I'll do whatever you've called me to do. So it says, he said, Hineni, here am I. And he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, or Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as an olah, a burnt offering, on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Two things that we have. He's told to go to the land of Moriah, and this will be the land, Moriah will be the land around Jerusalem, and this will be the very mountain, Mount Moriah, when David sins against God in numbering the people. God instructs him to go to the mountain of Moriah and buy a threshing floor from a Jebusite that lives there, and he's to build an altar and offer sacrifice to God. Later on, his son, Shlomo, or Solomon, the king of peace, the prince of peace, the picture of the Messiah that's come, Shlomo, Solomon, builds the temple on the site of David's altar. So everything that's happening over in Genesis 22 is going to be a foreshadowing of what will happen in the coming of the temple, and it will carry over to the coming of Yeshua. We're going to find on this very same mountain that Yeshua the Messiah will be offered up on the tree. We're going to find that all the events that take place in Genesis 22 were a prophecy of Yeshua in his first coming, and if his being slain, his being bound to the altar. We're told that Abraham is instructed to offer Isaac as an olah. There are 5 types of offerings that God has given in the Scriptures. The olah, the burnt offering. We have the shalem, the peace offering. The hatat, the sin offering. We have the asham, the guilt offering. And we have the minha, the bread offering. Each one of these offerings will teach us about God. Each one of these offerings will teach us about the things that Yeshua, the Messiah, will perform. Now here, an olah, a burnt offering, is unique. He tells Abraham, take Isaac, your only begotten son, take him. And of course, Isaac is a picture of Yeshua. Take Isaac, your only begotten son, and offer him up as an olah. Now when we have an olah, a burnt offering, it will be totally consumed. And number 2, it has to be freely given. Not only does it have to be freely given, but the person is to be filled with joy as he offers the olah. Now realize what God has called Abraham to do. He's to offer his son who he loves to be totally consumed, totally destroyed. He has to do this freely and out of his heart. He has to be overflowing with joy. In fact, if Abraham does not have the joy, then the sacrifice is not accepted. In this, brothers and sisters, we see such a picture of God, because God offered his only begotten son, Yeshua, as an olah for us, as a totally consumed sacrifice, freely given, and God was joyous in doing it. Why? Because God loves us so much. We look at Abraham. Now remember that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And the years have gone by. Usually when you see this event done in cartoons on Christian television, you see Isaac as a little boy. Let me tell you, in Jewish tradition, they teach that Isaac was 37 years old. I believe he was 33. I think that he was a picture of Yeshua the Messiah. But one thing is for sure, whether he was 33 or he was 37 years old, when you have a man of that age along with a man that is 133 or 137, the younger man could easily have said, no way, I'm not going to submit to this. As we see the father submitting to the instruction of God, so do we see the son submitting to the father. And in this we see Yeshua, who said, no man takes my life, I lay it down of myself. So let's continue on here in Genesis chapter 22, verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Notice that Abraham rose early in the morning. You know, if it was me, and I was told that I had to offer my son as a sacrifice, I think that my reaction would be to stall, would be to go and stay in bed. I might not be able to sleep, but stay in bed as long as I could, get up and have an extra 2 cups of coffee, do every little chore that I could do, because I don't want to go out there and offer him up as a sacrifice. But Abraham had instruction from God, and Abraham rose early in the morning. A rich man, a man with many servants, he could have sent his servants out to saddle his donkey, to split the wood and do all the preparations, but Abraham set about performing the things that God had given to him. What an example for us. What a character type that we're seeing for us to mold ourselves to this and learn how should we respond to what God has called us to do. Verse 4, then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and he saw the place afar off. Brothers and sisters, let me tell you, what did he see? Yes, he saw Mount Moriah, but he saw more than that. He saw all the way into the future. He saw the coming of the Messiah. He saw not only the coming of the Messiah, but what would be accomplished by the offering of the sacrifice of Yeshua. He saw not only what would be accomplished by it, but he saw the restoration of mankind. He saw all the way into the 3rd day from the time that Yeshua would come. He looked into the time of the Messianic kingdom and the time that follows that, the time of the New Jerusalem, the time that in Hebrew we call the Olam Haba, the world to come. Verse 5, and Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. But God had told Abraham, you're to take your son and to kill him. But he tells us men, we, Isaac and myself, Isaac and myself, we will return to you. As we read in the book of Acts, chapter 7, we see that Abraham believed God. He fully expected to kill Isaac there on the mountain, but God had told him that through Isaac, that the seed would be established, that the Messiah would come, and that the blessing of the people would come to the people that would come from Isaac. And he believed God, and God counted it to him for righteousness. By faith, he believed God. He had confidence in God, and so God had said it in some way, somehow, it must be performed. And so he believed that, yes, he would kill him, but that God would raise him back to life. Verse 7. And verse 6, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, just as the wood of the cross was laid on the shoulders of Yeshua. He took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And the 2 of them went together. In other words, the lamb was to be provided by God. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. The Akedah, the binding of the sacrifice. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, and the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Hineni, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went, he took the ram, offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Now what we have is a substitute. This ram caught in the thicket is a substitute for Isaac, for Isaac. This ram in Judaism represents the Messiah. The thicket that he's caught in represents the sins of the people. And the word that we have here, let me find my place real quick. It says that, so Abraham, it says, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Now there's an extra word that is in here in the Hebrew language that means in the future. Some of your translations have it afterward. In the future, this ram will be caught. The Messiah in the future will be caught for the sins of the people, and he will be offered as a substitute for those that were to be slain. In verse 13, verse 14, and Abraham called the name of the place Adonai Yireh. Now, Adonai in Hebrew is a word that means Lord. In Hebrew, we write the name of God, Yud-He, Vav-He. And the Jewish people do not pronounce this word. They do not, there's a word in English, Jehovah, that is used for this word in English. But generally in English, what we would say is the Hebrew word Adonai when we see the Yud-He, Vav-He, the name of God. Now we're going to have Adonai Yireh. You might know that as Jireh. Adonai Yireh. It does not translate as the Lord will provide. What it translates as, here in verse 14, is the Lord will be seen. The Lord will be seen. Okay, now I'd like you to remember that. And Abraham called the name of the place Adonai Yireh. The Lord will be seen. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. In other words, remember what we said, that this is the mountain that Yeshua the Messiah would be slain on, that he would be the ram caught in the thicket, or the sins of the people in the future, and it would all take place here on this mountain, that this would be seen here. So God is beginning to prophesy through the actions of Abraham all these events concerning Yeshua the Messiah. Now, as it goes on, it says, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven, and it goes on, it finishes the passage. Abraham and his son come back and worship, come back to the men that they have made this journey with. Now, in Jewish tradition, the two horns of the ram, remember we have a right horn and we have a left horn, are the two trumpets that are spoken of in the Scripture concerning marriage. We have the first trump, the shofar that we have in Exodus 19, verse 19, is understood by the Jewish people as being one of the horns of this ram. Now this is all Jewish tradition. I want you to understand that it is the left horn of that ram, and it signifies God entering into a betrothal with Israel. The right horn is the larger horn, and this is the horn that is called the last trump. This is why you call it the last trump, is because there are two horns on the ram. The first one, the left one, the right one being the last. This is the horn of the resurrection of the dead, the horn of Rosh Hashanah. This is the horn that will be blown to herald the coming of the Messianic kingdom. Now, a rabbi called Rabbi Bachai asked a question. He said, if the ram was consumed as a sacrifice, if it was burned as an olah, totally consumed on the altar, how can God use the horns from that ram to blow for the first trump and the last trump? And his answer was, God resurrected the ram. And of course we see, indeed, this is what happened in Yeshua the Messiah. He was resurrected from the dead. Now, remember that at the festival of Rosh Hashanah, we have the marriage ceremony. In Hebrew, we call this Kiddushin. This is where we enter into the fullness of marriage. This is where the second stage of marriage, where the groom comes for his bride. Remember, in betrothal, they were married, but not living together. The groom comes for his bride, and he receives her to himself, and they enter into the consummation of the marriage. They go into the honeymoon chamber, the chuppah, for the period of 7, Shavua in Hebrew, 7 days or 7 years, a week. And so we have one trumpet for the betrothal and a second trumpet for the kiddushin, for the full stage of marriage. Now in Judaism, we're going to have a third trumpet. This is called the great trumpet, or the great shofar. The Hebrew term is the shofar hagadol. This trumpet is the trumpet of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this trumpet is going to be the trumpet that is blown. As you read in Matthew chapter 24, it says that Yeshua comes with the sound, the great sound of a trumpet. It is the shofar hagadol. He's coming on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. All right, so we have 3 trumpets, and our trumpet of Rosh Hashanah is going to be the trumpet of the resurrection of the dead. Now you might remember that last week we looked at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, and we saw that with the coming of the Messiah, there will be a great blast of a shofar, and the dead in Messiah will rise first, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. We're going to look at a new term for the Messiah and see how it ties in to the trumpets and the resurrection of the dead. I'd like for you to turn to Isaiah and chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11. And we're going to look at verse 10. In Isaiah 11:10, it says, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse." This root of Jesse is Yeshua the Messiah, "who shall stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious." So we're going to have a term for the Messiah. It's banner. The Hebrew word is nisi. The Messiah will be the banner to the people. He will be lifted up. You remember that Yeshua said, "If I be lifted up, I'll draw all men unto me." He's going to be a banner, a nisi, to all the nations. He'll draw all men to him, to all the nations. And it tells us that his resting place shall be glorious. It's the Hebrew word menucha, and it is a term for the Sabbath or the Messianic kingdom, the millennium. I'd like for you to go to chapter 18 of Isaiah, verse 3. Now here's what you do. Anytime you see the term banner, immediately say, okay, I know what that is. It's the Messiah. It's just like the gates. Anytime you see the gates being opened, what is it? It's Rosh Hashanah. Anytime you see a trumpet, you figure out, is it the first trump? Is it the last trump? Or is it the great trumpet? All of these things, once you start training yourself to do this, you start seeing Yeshua, the Messiah, all over the place. Now, in chapter 18 of Isaiah, verse 3, this is going to be a key passage to the Jewish people. There's a very famous rabbi called Sa'adi Gaon, and he wrote a paper that was called the 10 Reasons for the Blowing of the Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. His last reason was the resurrection of the dead, and it was based on Isaiah chapter 18, verse 3. Now, you and I would pick up our Bibles, open our Bibles, we would look at Isaiah 18, and we'd say, I don't see the resurrection. But you see, we're coming from a Western culture, and we're not keyed in to the words that are going to mean different things to the people of the Middle East 2,000 years ago. In chapter 18, verse 3, all inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, when he lifts up a banner, now remember the banner is the Messiah, when he lifts up a banner on the mountains, you see it. And when he blows a shofar, a trumpet, you hear it. Now, we have to go back, and you can check this out in Hebrew. You can get an interlinear Bible and a Jacinius Hebrew lexicon. These are easily available. You can pick them up for a few dollars, and you can check out all these various terms and things and learn how to search things out for yourself. What it says, verse 3, all inhabitants of the world and dwellers in the earth, not on the earth. The difference between the two, we have two groups. The first group, all inhabitants, I'm going to abbreviate, all inhabitants of the world. These, according to the Jewish teaching, are the righteous living. And dwellers in the earth are the righteous dead. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 15? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that we're told that the dead in Messiah, that they will rise first, and we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds. This is where it's believed that Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, took that teaching from. That the Jewish understanding was that God would blow a shofar, it would be the last trumpet, that he would blow the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, and that the righteous dead would be caught up to heaven right along with the righteous living. You see, the Feast of Rosh Hashanah is going to teach us about the resurrection of the dead. God bless you. Next week, Ikvot HaMashiach.